Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself. Feeling ready to kick your sales into high gear? We're here to help. Check out our sales coaching and consulting services at predictablerevenue.com. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today I'm joined by Fred Diamond. He's the founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales, and we're going to talk about how an unusual podcast made him a better sales leader. Fred, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here.
Colin, I'm thrilled to be here. As I mentioned, I saw a bunch of my friends like Lee Sauls and Christy Jones have been on your show, so I'm following some formidable guests.
Both great episodes. Based on what I've heard about you and our pre-interview, I'm really excited to have this one. It's a really interesting kind of left turn. You run a sales podcast, and initially I thought, hey, we were talking about, the sales podcast. You run a sales podcast, you run a sales institute. And then we got into the pre, and you're also a Lyme disease expert. And me being my annoying, inquisitive self, I couldn't help but ask. So help me understand how you also became a sales expert and a Lyme disease expert.
It's interesting. Thank you. And again, we're doing today's show in April of 2024. The recording and Lyme Disease Awareness Month is actually May. So I'm grateful for this. We all have our business lives and we all have our personal lives and our social media lives and all those things. I run the Institute for Excellence in Sales, and we help typically B2B, business to business, in some cases B2G, business to government employers, attract, retain, develop, and elevate top-tier sales talent. So some of our customers or members include companies like Amazon Web Services, Oracle, Salesforce, and we do, like a lot of your guests, we do sales programs. We have a woman in sales program that we're very proud of. We do events. We have some designations, like our premier sales employer. We have a big award event this year. It's going to be on May 17th, where we get a couple hundred people in a room to recognize great sales talent. And so a lot of people know me for that and my Sales Game Changers podcast, which were over 700 episodes where I interview sales leaders and a lot of people like you do. But most people, they see me on LinkedIn, so they see that. From the Lyme disease side, I had somebody in my personal life who had what they call chronic Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a tick-borne illness. We estimate that 63 million people around the globe have Lyme disease. It is truly a global disease. Unfortunately, when it gets into what they call the chronic stage, which is only 4 weeks after you were bitten by a tick, a lot of complications kick in. It's very, very difficult to cure. It's very, very difficult to treat. It's very difficult to diagnose. So when this particular person in my life had a major challenge related to the disease, I then decided to become an expert. This was almost 3 years ago to the day of this recording. And I dug in deep to understand everything about the disease. I began to realize that most family members and friends of people with chronic Lyme didn't really know what that person went through. So long story short, I started writing some articles for a publication called LymeDisease.org, and they were geared to help family members and friends understand what their loved one was going through. I then wrote a book, which was published in July of 2022, called Love, Hope, Lyme, What Family Members, Partners, and Friends Who Love a Chronic Lyme Survivor Need to Know. I actually published a sales book on that day called Insights for Sales Game Changers. I do my sales podcast and I publish a sales book. I published the Lyme book, and I also do a podcast called Love, Hope, Lyme. It's on YouTube. It's on Apple. I've only published 25 episodes, and Colin, we're way past 50,000 downloads and views of the show. And I get people who reach out to me all the time just thanking me for those efforts. But it just drove me. And the interesting sales angle is I think it's made me a more interesting person, and it's also shown a side of me that I always knew was there, but now people could see it and they wanted to engage in personal conversations. Everybody who's listening here is in sales. We're all trying to get conversations, right? What are you dealing with, customer? What are your goals? What keeps you up at night? All those kinds of things. And you can only have so many of those, right? Before there's a yes or a no. And we're constantly looking, how do we get past the no to all those things that your listeners, you're well over 300 episodes. So you've covered all these things, at some degree, and we're serving an audience. But when I started posting things about Lyme, people said, I have a niece who has Lyme disease, or my best friend from college's wife, she has Lyme disease, and it's helped them understand and be more empathetic about what they were going through.
It's interesting, like going through the writing a book process that I'm in right now. It's a ton of work to say, hey, I've got a sales institute, a podcast, a sales book, and on top of all that, I'm going to stack this thing that is totally unrelated, and not just I'm going to take this on, I'm going to invest resources. I'm going to invest a significant amount of time. Can you talk to me about the decision to do that? And yeah.
I always knew I was going to write a sales book. And, like you, I have a lot of authors who've appeared on the Sales Game Changers podcast. And I would bring a lot of sales book authors to speak at the Institute for Excellence in Sales. It was something we were known for. We created a sales speaker bureau related to that. So I created the Institute for Excellence in Sales in 2012. And I always knew I had to publish a book, but I couldn't quite figure out what I was going to do. So finally, a situation happened in my personal life. Like I mentioned, someone very close to me decided to focus all of this person's resources on recovery from the disease. So I had more time to figure out, okay, what's important to me. And I said, I got to write a sales book. So I met with a good friend of mine who has published 10 books and has sold millions of books. And he said, why don't you do this? Do a 15-chapter book with 15 quotes from your Sales Game Changers podcast. And I said, that's brilliant. 150 pages, 15 chapters. What we did is we've transcribed every Sales Game Changers podcast episode from day one. So I had at the time I had 450 10-page Word documents. So we did this exercise to find out, okay? We did this exercise to figure out what were the most uttered words on the Sales Game Changers podcast. So this is before, AI became AI. So we did kind of like a quasi automated manual search. We came up with 30 words, and then we kind of narrowed it down to 20. And we had someone literally go through every show and find quotes that related to those words. Words like empathy, listening, teamwork, partnership, prospecting, things related to that, relationships. And we came up with great quotes, and I hired someone to kind of help me put it together, someone who helps people do books. And we put together a really good book. And what we realized was we had content for 10 books, right? Because we had so many great quotes. Again, as you know this as a podcaster, everybody you bring on the show is brilliant. And they all have something to say. Some may be more brilliant than others. But, they all have something interesting to say that other people will learn from. Even a quote will inspire someone to change their lives, right? So I'm working on this sales book. As I was digging into understanding and researching Lyme disease and everything about it, I realized there was nothing written for family members, partners, and friends. There were a bunch of thick medical books. There were a bunch of books written by people about their journey. Some celebrities, Tommy Hilfiger's daughter, Allie Hilfiger, had Lyme disease and wrote a book about it. Yolanda Hadid, who was one of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, wrote a book about her battle with Lyme disease. And then there was a whole slew of thinner books, maybe 100 to 150 pages on keto diet and Lyme, meditation and Lyme, herbs and Lyme. But there was nothing written for partners to understand what a spouse or a family member was going through. So I wrote an article for an organization called LymeDisease.org. I call them the CNN of the Lyme world. And they publish articles on treatment and science and medical and personal stories. I reached out to the woman who runs it. Her name is Dorothy Leland. And I said, can I write an article on what I've learned as someone in relationship with somebody with Lyme that I've learned about? And she said, sure. No one's ever asked us, so sure. I wrote an article. I published it in September of 2021. They posted it on their Facebook page and their group. It got 500 downloads, which was a lot. People start reaching out to me. Why did you write this? Nobody cares about this. People with this disease, it's a very lonely disease. People, it's hard to diagnose. So People think you're faking it, and there's no really good test. So it's just it's a whole miasma of problems. So they published it, and then she published it again. And people said, why don't you expand this into a book? So I was writing the sales book, and I said, you know what? I'm just going to do that. So I hired somebody from the Lyme world to kind of help me process it. It's interesting. The sales book I sent to 2 people to review because it's our livelihood. We know it. We know it's right and wrong. The Lyme book I sent to like 40 people to review, people that I had just met in the Lyme world. I mean, this is like, as I like to say, I'm a history major with an MBA. So, I didn't have a medical degree. People should be asking me for medical advice, but I'm a very good researcher. And a lot of the people listening to your and my podcast, if you're good at sales, you got to be a good researcher because you got to find the challenges that your customer is going through and the industry challenges and regulations that may be causing difficulty for your customers and that you can help, hopefully. And I had 20 friends, people who knew me and knew this other person and were interested in, me helping to get this published, and came up with a good book, changed it around a little bit. Originally, I was going to call it Love, Loss, Lyme. But then I realized community, they've all lost. You can't hold a job. You've lost relationships. It's the extreme fatigue and brain fog that comes with it can cause you to not work, cause you to change your personality, people to leave your life. So I changed it to Love, Hope, Lyme, which kind of goes, it's a better message for the sales world. Of course, it was for the Lyme world, but it even kind of shifted a lot of how I thought about sales as well.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Well, sales is all about aspiration, right? So, everybody, we started the Institute for Excellence in Sales in 2012. And we began to realize that some things might seem easy, right? I mean, there's tons of sales trainers out there. There's tons of great salespeople. It's not that hard to really know what to do, but you run into blocks all the time. Even the great salespeople, something happens, industry changes, a big thing like pandemic, obviously, or your company gets sold. Maybe you were 30 years at a company and then IBM comes in or Microsoft or whomever comes in and buys the company. So all of a sudden you're redundant. So you've had this great 20, 30 year run. All of a sudden, you have to rethink things. So there's blocks and what sales trainers and people like you and I do is help people get past the blocks. So in understanding this disease, which there is treatment for, but it's a very, very dark and lonely, like I mentioned before. It's a very, there's no good tests. Once it gets to the chronic stage, it's not like one thing happens. The analogy I use is if you break your ankle anywhere in the world, in Sydney or Singapore or Shanghai or Sacramento, every orthopedic surgeon on the planet is going to take some x-rays. They're going to put you in a walking boot or a cast, and they're going to say, sit down for 6 weeks. Then we're going to put you on 2 weeks of rehab and you should be fine. There's no Facebook groups for people with broken ankles. There's no associations created to help people get past the mental trauma of a broken ankle. Now, you might have gotten some things that you need some counseling with, but, there's thousands hundreds, I should say, of Lyme disease charities and advocacy groups because there's so many problems related to it. But I would see people who got the disease and then they would create a charity to raise funds for medical supplies or appointments or medicine, if you will. And I began to see this community was pulling together to raise each other, from a very, very dark place. And I would go into Facebook groups that I didn't even know existed and people saying horrible things about what they were going through. And then seeing 50 people chime in with, PM me, let's talk. Or maybe there's an organization where you live in Kansas. Maybe you need a different type of a treatment. Maybe you need a doctor that understands what you're going through. There's very specific doctors who understand Lyme. It's a very, very unique and small subset. So people would say, hey, have you tried this? Or people would say, I've been trying this new herbal protocol, but I'm not getting better. And then people would say, you need to give it 3 months. Or you need to ensure that if you're doing that protocol, you have to stop eating eggs, whatever it might be. And I began to see all these people coming together and supporting each other. And I said, that's what we need in the sales world, right? It's not competition against obviously sales in a lot of cases is competitive, You lose a deal to a competitor, you lost the deal. It's not a great thing, but you're not going to die. So what do you do tomorrow, right? And how do you tell your boss you need help, right? And how do you be team? A lot of people say sales is a team sport. In some regards it is. Do you have the supportive environment? Have you built your network, right? A lot of the people that work with us at the Institute for Excellence in Sales sell into the public sector. So you might be competing one day with another company, and tomorrow they may be a partner because they're the incumbent. Or the government customer says, we want technology A, but we also have this new requirement for technology B. So, you see companies that you would think are head-to-head competitors have to work together to figure it out. So that's what we like to talk about at the Institute for Excellence in Sales. And that's something that really got elevated to me when I got deep into this Lyme world.
It's something that, when we were on our first, the pre-call for this, it shows up in on your professional calls. And it's not something that's necessarily going to lead to more sales, but it's a part of you. Were you hesitant about kind of making this part of your brand? Did you worry about, any downsides connected with, distracting conversations or anything like that?
That's a great question. No, and actually, I wanted to be, careful with some of the things that I communicated. But when I began to meet all these people who were reaching out to me, I first published that first article on LymeDisease.org. I had this is April of 2021. I just had all this information that I didn't see published anywhere. So I said, I'd like to write this article from a family member perspective. And like I mentioned, I had 500 people comment, and then I had 100 people reach out to me, and people were saying things in the comments like, nobody cares. I can't believe there's this human being who cares. And then it was published again. And then people would reach out and say the same thing. It's like more people would find it and say, nobody cares about people who have this disease. The medical profession dismiss a lot of people. Even the large group in the medical profession that says that chronic or persistent Lyme doesn't even exist. There's an organization called the Infectious Disease Society of America, which dispute that chronic Lyme even exists. If you Google or search, does chronic Lyme exist? You're going to see pages of people who denied that it even exists. I've seen it firsthand. I've spoken to thousands of people. And I said, you know what? I don't need to be silent about this. And I didn't, it's interesting. I've gotten 4 clients because of this, where 4 people who are VPs of sales have reached out and said, why are you doing all this Lyme stuff? And I told him a little bit of this story. And one guy said to me, my 32-year-old son has chronic Lyme, used to be an athlete, used to have a great career, hasn't left his room in 3 years. And, it was interesting. I'll tell that story in a little bit. I'll tell it right now. This guy was a VP of sales. He was a customer of mine 10 years ago. And he was great for a year, and then he kind of dropped out. So the way my business works at the IES is companies join every year. And we renew them. And we've had companies like Amazon and Salesforce and Cvent Software who've been partners for almost a decade now. But this guy just kind of dropped out. And after a while, I just thought, you know what? It's not a good fit. I'm not going to really get concerned about it. About a year and a half ago, I was at a conference in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, not far from where I am. And I saw the guy across the lobby of the hotel. And I kind of gave a wave. And he kind of started walking towards me. So I'm thinking like, okay, something, maybe he wants to talk or something. He comes over and he says, we're Facebook friends and LinkedIn connected. He said, tell me about this Lyme stuff. And I told him the story, like I mentioned. And he said, I have a 32-year-old son who hasn't left his room in 3 years. He was an athlete. He's really smart, had a great career, but the fatigue and the brain fog has just caused him to become a different person. And Collin, as I mentioned to you before, we had one of the most authentic conversations I've ever had in my life. I'd have to say to him, well, tell me your pain. What keeps you up at night? I know what keeps him up at night. He has a 32-year-old son who used to be amazingly healthy, who can't get out of bed now. And I've spoken to hundreds of people who are going through similar things. So I said, have you tried SOT therapy? Yeah, we tried that, but it's really not a good fit because he also has this genetic disorder. Okay. Well, have you looked into Dr. whomever, who I know is not far from you? Yeah, we tried him blah, blah, blah. So we had and I knew what he was saying because by this point, I wrote a book. So I'm like an expert on the topic, and I talk to Lyme doctors and survivors every single day. I get God blessed like 5 times a day from people in that world. Thank you for advocating. And we talked for 30 minutes, and then he said, all right, well, tell me what's going on with the IES, Institute for Excellence in Sales. And I gave him the overview. I said, why don't we have a talk with, he had a partner named Joe. I said, you and Joe. We did a call 2-3 weeks later, a Zoom call. And then a month later, they renewed their membership. They became a member, and they had it for like 8 years. But if I didn't post on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram to some regard, and let people know about this advocacy, we would have had a reason to talk. Does he need the Institute for Excellence in Sales? We help our customers. We give them tools to help their women in sales. We have leadership programs. We give them access to some of the people you've had on the podcast. We find resources like your company if they need outsource SDR work or, prospecting assistance, whatever it might be. And, there's value, a lot of value in being a participant. But, we never would have had the conversation if I wasn't outwardly verbal about it.
I'm curious. I do want to talk about kind of how it impacted yourself as a sales leader. I am super curious about the research process for the book, because zero to expert in 3 years, you must be very good at research. I'm super curious. Can you talk about that process and what you went through? Obviously, there was that, a significant part of your life was changed because of this. And so I'd love to understand, what was that research process like?
Yeah. So when I realized that I needed to learn more about this particular disease and how it affected someone that I cared about, I went to Amazon and I bought every book on Lyme disease. And that's where I told you before, there's the thick medical ones and there's the personal accounts, then there's the nuanced books. And I bought every book. Literally the summer of 2021, all I did was read about Lyme disease. This particular, someone had mentioned to me in the past that they didn't want to spend time on Facebook groups. So I went into Facebook, which I'm at the time was a active user. And I typed in Lyme, 1,000 pages show up, 1,000 groups, Lyme disease, Facebook groups. I had no idea. Some of these groups had 1,000 people. Some had tens of thousands of people. And they're all talking about the same thing, whatever the circumstance was. Like I mentioned before, hey, I just tried this treatment, but it doesn't work. What do you suggest? And then 50 people would say, you need to give it more time, or you need to give up eggs, whatever it might be. And I'm reading these things, and I reached out to people and I said, can I talk to you about this? And some people were very kind. And I also knew some people. I also called anyone in my life who ever uttered the word Lyme disease and reached out to them and had conversations. And I was really trying to understand, what someone in my life was going through with this disease. And there's a lot of people in that situation. There's not as many who've heard the books, or do podcasts, but there's a ton of people who had to become what they call Lyme disease detectives, because everybody's circumstance is different and there's no silver bullet. There's no pill. Like I talked to you before about the broken ankle. It's the same treatment for everybody. Yeah, maybe you need surgery ahead of time or something to reset the ankle or something. But for the most part, you're going to be in a cast for 6 weeks and you're going to do rehab almost invariably around the world with this disease. And even cancer, there's protocols for cancer. There's not like 1,000, there's, a couple dozen, if you will. For this particular, I'm not going to talk about cancer or anything, but for this particular disease, there's not one cure. A lot of it depends on your genetics. A lot of it depends on childhood trauma, things that have happened to you in the past. I remember I attended a webinar in the summer of 2021, and it was put on by one of the top Lyme doctors on the planet. And I remember I was kind of watching it. It was 8:00 at night and watching the webinar. I'm like, okay, I know that. This is only 3 months after I started doing all the work. And then in the 59th minute, Collin, he said, and by the way, if you don't address lingering childhood trauma, you're never going to cure from chronic illness. And I was like, oh, so dealing with childhood trauma is a thing. So then I went down that angle to try to figure out where that plays into this. And having a chronic illness like this causes a lot of anxiety, and it brings up a lot of things that are addressed, from your past. So if, it was funny, I tell people, I know it got me 4 clients. I know people now have referenced me. I get people all the time who reach out and say, my friend Joe said I should call you. People that I don't even really know, but I know from LinkedIn or something. And I tell people I didn't sit down in January of 2021 and say, okay, to grow my business, I'm going to have a bunch of podcasts. I'm going to do some webinars. We're going to do some events. I'm going to write a book about a very difficult disease. It just kind of happened because it affected my life. And, to some degree, I saw a hole. There was never a book or never anybody in my position. There's a lot of doctors, a lot of mothers who have children who are advocating. There aren't too many spouses. It's a difficult disease. It's hard to maintain a relationship. I had read that 75% of relationships with somebody with a chronic illness will end because it's just too difficult to focus on the relationship and the recovery and all the stuff that these diseases, do to you neurologically and mentally as well.
It seems like, and to kind of bridge back into the professional world, it seems like it's made you a much more empathetic person. You've done all of this work, for a particular individual, but now it is for a group of particular individuals. How has this changed kind of how you approach, running your team, working with clients?
That's a great question. And I'm going to refer to 2 podcasts that we did in 2019. I used to do my podcast in person. I would physically, I was using the podcast to meet sales VPs. So I had my 2 ATR 2100 mics, which I still have. I had my Zoom H5 recorder. I had all these filters that I really didn't need, but it looked like it was more of a thing. And I would go to VPs of sales offices and interview them on their greatest sales success and challenges and mentor stories. And I interviewed a woman, her name is Alyssa Merwin Henderson, and she's in charge of LinkedIn sales for Sales Navigator for one of their 3 divisions. And I interviewed her in downtown Washington, D.C., and she talked about how being vulnerable was one of her superpowers, which showed her people, I'm not hiding anything. I'm going to let you know when things are good, when things are bad. And that was one of the last physical shows I did in person. I remember where we did it. It was downtown D.C. LinkedIn's office was right next to Bernie Sanders' office, his campaign office. And it was a great interview. And I remember I published that. And then one of the keywords that everybody was kicking around when the pandemic kicked in and we were all sent home was empathy. And I remember we did a podcast with a guy, his name was Dan Cole, and he's a sales leader. He's been around, been with a lot of great companies. We used to do them as webinars. And at the beginning of the pandemic, from like March to almost for a year to like March of 2021, we did them as a go-to-webinar every day at 2:00. We would get 150, 200 people calling in or watching, and then we would take questions from the audience. It was kind of like a live Zoom show. Someone asked Dan Cole, when can we stop being empathetic? He said, do we have to keep on being empathetic? And Dan Cole gave a great answer. This was like May of 2021, when that was the big keyword is everybody's going through this. We're all in the same ocean, but different boats, whatever people's statements were. And Dan said, empathy is the number one core of sales. He says, if you are not an empathetic person, you do not belong in sales, because it's about the other person, and it's about understanding what they're trying to achieve, and it's about what their company is dealing with right now. And he said, if you're struggling right now because you're having to overload on that, I remember we did the show on a Friday. He said, take the weekend off, go to the beach, go take a long walk by a stream, and you better come back on Monday, because if you've lost an empathy gene, you ain't going to be successful in sales. For me personally, and that's when I did that research project I mentioned about the book, empathy was one of our top 3 words. Listening, I think, was number 1. Prospecting might have been number 2, and then empathy was a big one. And it's also helped me, and I'm talking to Lyme disease survivors like every day. I must have had 2,000 conversations with people, and some of them are online, Zoom, not Zoom, but LinkedIn or Facebook communications. And I see what these people are going through, man, and it blows with a capital B. It is not good to go through this. And you know what? I'm lucky here. It's like any problem that I have in closing business compared to seeing people who haven't gotten out of bed in a year, people who can't afford because they can't work. So they're beyond broke, and people whose family hasn't spoken to them in years because they don't believe them. And, if there's that expression, which you've probably heard, when you have your health, you can think of 1,000 things. When you don't have your health, you can only think of one thing. And I never truly appreciated that until I got deeper into this world. So I think I was probably a naturally empathetic person to begin with. Interested, curious. You talked about the research, but if you don't care about what people are going through, and their story may not be particularly interesting to you, but you better care about them, or else they're going to figure out real quick that they don't want to do business with you. So, and then the other thing that it's taught me too is you don't have to do business with everybody. And I don't mean if you lose a deal, you let them go. It's kind of like, you know what? People can be friends. I have a lot of people I talk to on LinkedIn, and I used to think, like, okay, how am I going to get them to become a customer? Are they going to be a reference or a referral source?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people I talk to on LinkedIn every day that have just become friends, And I've told them this story. I've actually gotten on my car. I've done 3 cross half country road trips. Again, I live in Virginia. I drove in summer 21 to Minnesota, to Texas. This past summer, I did another one where I did some book signings and met people. And when you get that face-to-face, in a restaurant or wherever it might be, it definitely helps grow those relationships. So empathy is a huge word. I never truly appreciate it. I always kind of looked at it as like, got to be empathetic. Okay, good. Empathy. Checked off. And now I realize it really is the core of life.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we initially started talking about sales, and I was thinking, okay, well, how can we, he's got this really great sales institute. There's got to be so many sales things that we can learn. And the biggest learning I'm pulling away from you is the empathy, is the trust, is the authenticity of you show up as, somebody who's obviously a sales leader, a thought leader, somebody who's helping move the profession forward. And you're also this person who's helping all these other folks that are struggling with this thing. And that it's such an authentic feeling that it's helped me get to know Fred, even though we're not talking about IES. This conversation makes, if you're having this with prospects, it helps validate you as a person, especially when most sales are moving to Zoom and Zoom. It's very easy to distrust the person on the other side of that box. And this has built that additional connection. And we're not even talking about, hey, can I buy from you? We're talking about something totally off that doesn't move the deal forward at all, but we've spent quite a bit of time on it.
Yeah, and just a little aside, I mean, I want people to become customers of the Institute. I mean, we run a business, we feel great about it. We're doing amazing things for women in sales with our Women in Sales Leadership Program. My partner, her name is Gina Spracuzzi, is just an amazing woman who's helping young women and women who are advancing their career get more out of it. The other thing, as you raised a great question, the other thing that I've kind of learned from this as well is the whole concept of commitment. And, what are you truly committed to? And mind if I tell you one more story about that and tie this in?
Yeah, go for it.
So prior to all of this, I was on boards, various charity boards. And I remember somebody once told me, when you join a charity board, you bring one of 3 things. You bring wealth, you bring wisdom, or you bring work. So there's a lot of people who have the ability just to write a check. And that's great. Charities need money, social organizations, nonprofits, etc. And there's a lot of people who can offer advice, maybe better ways, especially people in business, that they can better communicate or better get the message out there. And then there's work. You want people who show up every month at the meetings and maybe volunteer, depending on what's appropriate. And I had been on a bunch of boards, and I always felt good about it. Oh, I'm a good person, blah, 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 blah. I volunteer. And I began to realize as I was getting deep into this Lyme world and understanding that millions of people were going through this and that there was this huge crevasse that needed to be filled, I was like, am I committed to this? Have I really been committed to like anything, in my life? And I'm going to get a little deep with you here, but I have been, of course. But it's kind of like, how committed are you as humans to what you say you are? How committed are you to, making your neighborhood a better place? How committed are you to ensuring that your kids have what they need? Little things like when people say, I'm committed to losing weight. Okay, well, why are you drinking beer? Well, I'm going to drink the beer and tomorrow. I'm like, okay, well, you're not that committed to losing weight if you're drinking beer. Nothing wrong with drinking beer, but if you're committed to losing weight, beer is not going to help you lose weight. It's going to be against, even light beer is against you losing weight. Same thing too. It's like, if you're committed to being a great salesperson, a great sales professional, do you know all the regulations that have recently affected your industry? Do you know all of your competitors and what their messaging is? Do you know what your customers' annual plan looks like? The great sales professionals that you and I interview on our various podcasts, they're doing those things. Yeah, I remember I have a son who was a hockey player, and we were trying to get him into college with hockey. So we hired a coach. There's a whole world of people. I don't know if you're a hockey guy, but there's a whole world of people who help you get into college. It's probably the same thing with gymnastics and lacrosse and debate, whatever it might be. I remember we met with this guy, and he said for $3,000, he's going to get my kid into college via hockey. And I remember he was talking to my son the first time, and he said, you're competing against kids to get into college. If you're watching TV, nothing wrong with watching TV, but are you doing push-ups while you're watching TV, or are you laying on the couch eating potato chips? And, the guy who is on the ground doing, crunches and push-ups is going to be ahead of you, even though you both have the same goal. So you need to really think about your commitment. Same thing with sales is for the people who are listening to you and I speaking right now. I applaud you for taking 45 minutes to an hour out of your life. Doesn't matter if you're driving or mowing the lawn or on the treadmill. I don't care. You are listening to something that hopefully is going to help you become more of a professional. And professionals are committed to what they're doing.
It's incredible. And I'll just comment on my experience in the conversation as somebody who's on the other end. And I'm not probably an ideal buyer for Fred, but the connection between like the depth of which I've gotten to know Fred and what you care about and what you shared, and I guess the strength of that connection compared to some other guests where, we've got really tactical in sales and I've got to know, their thoughts and how they think about things. Those are very, very surface level pieces. But I feel like I know Fred twice, 3 times as good as almost any other guest because we've got to this level. And I suspect it's the same on sales calls, even if they don't necessarily have somebody who has Lyme in their life, the chances of you developing a much deeper conversation in that sales process, because you've been able to share this, it gives you this, it makes you a wider person from a personality, a complexity standpoint. And it's certainly helped strengthen this connection. I feel like I know you quite a bit better than most of the guests.
Well, I applaud you for being willing to talk about this. You do a sales podcast. I've seen your previous guests, people that I've spoken to about sales. Lee Sauls was my sales speaker of the year in 2021. So, and I know a lot of your other guests I've spoken to about sales. And, we're the profession. I love talking about sales. But, it's like what I realized when I had that conversation with that guy in the hotel, I remember thinking like, usually when you're in a sales conversation, even if you've prepared, you're still thinking about what to ask next, right? Because your goal in sales is to get to the next conversation, to get to the next, keep going. I remember James Muir wrote that great book, The Perfect Close. And do you know him at all?
I've read, I think, one of his books. I don't think I read Perfect Close.
It's a great book. I interviewed him probably in the middle of the pandemic. And I remember before I read it, I'm like, okay, the close, right? The moment, at that moment, it's like, Collin, here's my proposal. Can we get this done in budget one? Like, that moment. And his point was there might be 42 closes, in the process. How are we going to close this call? Are we going to schedule the next call? Are we going to schedule a call with your CFO, with someone on your tech team? So there's all those closes along the way. So, I enjoy talking about sales. I have a business called the Institute for Excellence in Sales. But when I had that conversation with the guy in the hotel, I remember thinking to myself, well, I remember at one point I said, what do I ask next? But it wasn't like from a sales manipulative perspective, and it might have been fleeting. It was like, have you tried SOT therapy? Have you tried oxidation therapy? Have you spoken to Dr. Jemzek, who has the Jemzek clinic? Is your son off of gluten? Have you tested for mold? It wasn't like, question do I ask you? What keeps you up at night? Like I told you before, I know those things, but the questions I asked him were, and they weren't rehearsed. I didn't have any idea that this guy had Lyme disease in his children's life, which means it's in your life. But the moment that he came up to me and told me, all of a sudden I had the right questions to ask, but it wasn't like, okay, what's question number 3? It was just like relevant, important, valuable questions. And those 30 minutes, they flew by. We're still in business. I don't talk to him about Lyme anymore because there's nothing, not that we don't have to. We just talk about other things. His company is now a participant in our program. So I talk to his directors and he knows if we ever need to talk about Lyme. In a lot of cases, the Lyme is like one conversation, and then all of a sudden you've crossed this transom because that this person has something in common with you. Mm. And it's not just like we both like fishing, that old sales trick looking for, something in the guy's office. It's like, I know something.
I see you love lamps.
I see you have carpeting. Oh, I also, what's your favorite carpet? I see you breathe air. Oh, we have that in common. What's your favorite air? No, but seriously, when you have something like this in common, you've already broken down, like you had just said, you've broken down those barriers. And, it's like, you don't want to be asking people, do you have Lyme disease in your world? No. Well, do you have cancer in your world so that I can talk to you about my experience with cancer? I mean, that doesn't come across as authentic, but, be interesting. I mean, it's just the last thing is, 2 things I'm going to leave you with here. One is, unless you want to ask me more questions, one is be interesting, right? I mean, just be interesting. And be interesting could be having a conversation with me about the direction of my industry. Show me that you are interested in where my industry is going. Because if I'm a CIO or tech director or director of HR at a company, I'm interested in the direction of my business. I'm interested in where my industry is going. I'm going to be interested in your technology and your solution and your service if it's going to help me get there faster, quicker, or better. But every customer isn't really thinking about you. They're thinking about where they need to go and if you can help me or not. And I forget the second point I was going to make, but, just be interested and be interesting.
I love that.
Oh, I just remember what I was going to say. I also host a podcast called the Love Hope Lyme podcast. And I interview doctors and people in the Lyme advocacy world. There's an organization called Center for Lyme Action, and their job is to lobby Capitol Hill to get funding. Cancer is funded at $50 billion per year. Lyme is like $175 million. So they're trying to keep growing that. And this woman's name is Bonnie Crater. She's actually an executive in Silicon Valley. And at the end of the conversation, I remember I just said, and she created the Lyme Center for Lyme Action because she wanted to. I think she might have had someone in her family. And I remember I said, Collin, do something. If you're listening to the show, do something. Just do anything. Go create something. Create a 501c3. Go fix something. Just go do something.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it here. I think some of my best learnings in sales have come from people outside of the space, and not that you're outside the space. You were very much in and a part of the space, But the conversation about Lyme as an angle into authenticity and trust, and connecting with other people, has been such a very informative episode just for me to have gone through and record. I hope, you listening are on the other end. I think some of my favorite sales books are not sales books at all. And I'm always looking for, whether it's entrepreneurship, product market fit, sales, growing revenue, what can we learn from people that are not in sales? And I think this has been one of my favorite conversations of the year. So thank you so much, Fred, for coming on.
I appreciate that. And I, again, just want to acknowledge you, for having the conversation, for being open to it. I know it's different than the other 350 episodes that you've done. And I just want to acknowledge you again. You're well over 350 episodes, I believe. And the work that your company is doing great. The reason I originally engaged with you is I was interested in what you were doing. And I love talking about sales, and we're all in sales. And salespeople have to figure out how to differentiate themselves, because customers aren't sitting around waiting for you to call. But if you're going to provide value for them, and a lot of value comes in the authenticity that you were talking about, then you need to develop that skill. And I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. You're welcome. And it's been an enjoyable learning experience for me as well. I'd love if you could take a minute, just tell us a little bit about the Institute and what you help your customers with.
Thanks. Yeah, we're called the Institute for Excellence in Sales. Our mission is to help B2B, or business to government, enterprise companies attract, retain, develop, and elevate top-tier sales talent. We have a global women in sales program that is helping women at two levels, either at the VP level or at the emerging leader level, first job in leadership. Those are hybrid programs. We do the live portions of them in Northern Virginia, Tyson's Corner area, where we're based, right outside of DC. And we're excited about that. We also have a couple of designations. We have one called the Premier Sales Employer designation, which is basically great places to work for sales organizations. And we have our Premier Women in Sales Employer, where we recognize companies that are great places for women. We're all about the profession. We're all about helping sales organizations, typically B2B and enterprise, grow and become more effective.
Love it. If people are looking for to connect with you, what's the best place for them to get in touch?
Go on LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn. I post every day. I comment on posts frequently as well. So easiest way, LinkedIn, Fred Diamond. If you want to reach out to me on Facebook, that's fine too. I do have a website. I mean, we have our Institute website, and I also have freddiamond.com, but the best place for your listeners is definitely LinkedIn.
Perfect. And if they're trying to get in touch or trying to find out more about the Lyme disease side of things, where can they go?
Yeah, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn or Facebook. I get a lot of people on LinkedIn in the business world who I do the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. I post every day. So 1 out of 5 posts is typically related to Lyme disease. There's not a big Lyme community, and it's amazing. Facebook has a huge Lyme community. Instagram has a huge Lyme community. Reddit, has like 15,000 people talking about Lyme challenges. Of course, Twitter, X, has a lot of people as well. People are coming together. And that's the other thing too about sales is that when I realized there were all these people on Facebook, and some of these groups, Collin, had tens of thousands of people, and people asking questions and getting advice and support, that kind of, we talked about before, helped me understand that you got to get that community and you got to ask them and provide value, show expertise, and show that you love people.
Love it. Fred, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks.
Thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week.